Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a room at the center of the universe. Not the geometric center, not a point you could plot on any chart or calculate from any set of coordinates. But a center in every way that matters. The center of faith, the center of power, the center of a civilization that stretches across 100,000 worlds and counts its population in the hundreds of billions. At the heart of terror, the ancient cradle world of humanity, buried beneath layers of city that have been built and collapsed, and built again over tens of thousands of years. There is a room that almost no living soul has ever entered. The corridors that approach it run through one of the most fortified complexes in human history. The doors that seal it are mechanisms of such engineering sophistication that the tech priests who maintain them no longer fully understand their own operation. The warriors who guard it have dedicated their entire lives that began with the stripping away of everything they were before, of name and family and any personal future, to ensuring that nothing unauthorized ever crosses that threshold. And in that room sits a throne, and on that throne sits something that was once a man. He has not spoken in 10,000 years. He has not moved. He has not opened his eyes. He has not turned his gaze toward any of the billions of souls who cry out to him every single day. In every language humanity has ever invented, from every corner of a galaxy that burns with war. The prayers wash over him in waves that psychers describe as actual sound, a constant roar, like standing at the edge of the ocean during a storm that never ends, and still he does not answer. Children are born, live their whole lives, and die in his name. Entire generations of soldiers march into the dark, carrying his image stitched into their uniforms, and not one of them will ever receive so much as a whisper in return. The highest institution in imperial religion, the Adeptus Ministorum, the Ecclesiarchy, the galaxy-spanning church with its billions of clergy and its cathedrals that dwarf cities, has built its entire theology around interpreting the will of someone who has not communicated directly in 10,000 years. The cardinals who run that church have refined interpretation to an art form approaching the mathematical. They have texts and counter-texts, traditions and counter-traditions, heresies and the heresies of those heresies. They fight political battles over the correct reading of events that occurred when the civilization they inhabit was young. They burn people alive for holding wrong opinions about a god who has never confirmed any opinion about anything. For 10,000 years, the emperor of mankind has been silent. But in recent times, something has been changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a glacier moves, the way tides shift over geological ages, but changing nonetheless. The psychers who serve at the heart of the Astronomicon, those wretched souls whose minds are burned away to fuel the great beacon that guides ships through the warp, have begun to report something different in the current. Something that shouldn't be there. Seers across the Imperium have started waking from their meditative trances with expressions that sit somewhere between rapture and terror. Pilgrims standing in the cathedrals of 1,000 worlds have claimed to see the golden light behind the stained glass shift into something that almost looks like a face. And the face looks back. The custodians at the door of the Sanctum Imperialis, who have noticed the changes in the throne room's psychic resonance over recent decades, sometimes speak to each other in the long hours of their vigil about what those changes mean. Not officially, the custodians do not engage in idle speculation as a matter of culture, but in the way that people who have devoted their entire existence to a single task will sometimes, in their private moments, voice what they sense, what they feel in the room behind the door they guard. They describe it as a warming, something that was very cold, very distant, very still, like being in the presence of a deep winter lake, beautiful and massive and silent, beginning to change. The stillness is the same, the vastness is the same, but the cold is different, less a frozen thing and more a sleeping thing. The distinction matters, in the way that the distinction between ice and something merely very still always matters. Ice does not wake up. Something sleeping can. He has not spoken in 10,000 years. But every year that passes now carries something that was not there the year before. A quality that the most sensitive among his guardians have begun to notice, and that they hold very carefully in their minds, not quite allowing themselves to name it directly, because naming it would make it real in a way that feels momentous beyond what any of them are prepared for. The quality is anticipation. Something is coming. something that has been 10,000 years in the making. And when it arrives, the galaxy will never be the same. Something is stirring. And today we are going to talk about all of it. We are going to go all the way back to the beginning, to who the Emperor actually was before he ever sat on that throne, what the throne actually is, and why it was never supposed to hold him, what the silence of 10,000 years has done to the Imperium, and what the extraordinary gathering of signs and events in the current era of 40k might actually be pointing toward. We are going to explore the Star Child, the Terminus Decree, the secrets that even the High Lords of Terror don't know, and the one question that haunts every corner of Warhammer lore. What happens if the Emperor finally wakes up? Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and if you've got somewhere to be, I'd reschedule. Part 1. The silence that defines an age. Before we can talk about what it might mean for the Emperor to speak, we have to sit with the silence itself for a moment. Really sit with it. Because it is easy to say the words, 10,000 years, and let them pass through your mind without weight, without texture, without any real appreciation for the incomprehensible scale of what they mean. Think about what 10,000 years actually is. 10,000 years ago, from our real-world perspective, human civilization was barely beginning. The pyramids of Egypt hadn't been built yet. Writing hadn't been invented in any widespread form. The wheel was a new idea. Most of humanity lived in small settlements, following herds, farming the edges of river valleys, looking up at the same stars we look at now with no understanding of what they were. 10,000 years is the entire span of recorded human history. Every war, every empire, every discovery, every religion, every piece of art or literature or music that we consider foundational to what we are. And then some. And the Emperor has been silent for all of it. In the context of the 40k universe, those 10,000 years are the period called the Age of the Imperium. It is the age defined by the Emperor's absence. Every institution that exists in the 41st Millennium, the Adeptus Mechanicus with their machine, cult and their hoarded knowledge, the Inquisition with their endless hunt for heresy, the Ecclesiarchy with their galaxy, spanning church and their billions of faithful, the Adeptus Astartes in all their fearsome variety, the regiments of the Astra Militarum numbering in the incomprehensible millions. All of it grew up in the shadow of a throne that holds a silent god. This is a civilization that was shaped, at every level, by trying to carry out the will of someone who stopped communicating 10,000 years ago and has never resumed. The High Lords of Terror spend their political lives interpreting old texts and debating what the Emperor would have wanted. Missionaries travel to the furthest edges of human space to spread a faith based on a man who, during his own lifetime, explicitly rejected the idea of being worshipped as a god. Wars are fought and worlds are burned in the name of an entity that has given no direct instruction to anyone alive. The Imperium is at its core, a civilization that is trying to serve a master it can no longer reach, and that absence has costs. Terrible, grinding century by century costs. Without the Emperor's guidance, the Imperium has calcified. The great vision that drove the Great Crusade, the dream of a unified humanity, scientifically advanced, rational, spreading across the stars under its own power without need for gods or superstition, has not merely faded. It has been inverted. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium is deeply religious, deeply superstitious, deeply hostile to innovation and inquiry. The Adeptus Mechanicus treats technology not as a tool to be understood, but as a holy mystery to be preserved. The Inquisition burns scientists alongside heretics. Populations live in medieval conditions on worlds that orbit stars humanity has controlled for 10,000 years. The specific institutional mechanisms by which the Imperium has deteriorated are worth pausing on, because they are not the result of stupidity or malice. They are the result of what happens to a civilization that loses its guiding intelligence and attempts to operate on the basis of preserved instructions. Every bureaucracy in the Imperium was, at some point, created to serve a function. The Administratum exists to manage resources across 100,000 worlds. The Inquisition exists to protect humanity from internal and external threats. The Ecclesiarchy exists to maintain social cohesion across a vast and diverse population. These are real needs, and the institutions that address them are genuinely necessary. But institutions without active oversight calcify. They accumulate procedures. They develop internal cultures that prioritize the institution's own survival over the institution's original purpose. They develop language that sounds like they are doing what they were created to do, while actually doing something slightly different. and then something quite different, and eventually something almost entirely different. 10,000 years of operating without the emperor's active guidance has produced institutions that are sophisticated and powerful and deeply entrenched, and that have, in many cases, drifted significantly from what they were created to be. The light of the emperor still burns in the Astronomicon. Ships still navigate by it. The dream still flickers somewhere, in the hearts of the faithful. But the civilization it was meant to serve has become something the emperor himself would likely find unrecognizable. And through all of it, the wars, the heresies, the slow erosion of everything he built, he has said nothing. There is a word for this in the language of the Adeptus Custodes, those golden warriors who have stood at his side since before the heresy. The word is contemplation. They use it with great reverence, as if the millennia of silence are themselves a kind of communication, a message too profound and too vast for mere language to contain. The emperor is not absent, they say. He is thinking. He is working on something that operates on a scale of time and consciousness that no mortal mind could comprehend. Maybe they're right. Maybe they tell themselves that because the alternative, that he is simply too broken, too consumed by his endless battle against the powers of chaos, too diminished by the unimaginable weight of 10,000 years on the edge of death, is a truth that would shatter everything they have built their lives around. But things are changing. And the changes are big enough that even the custodes have started to look at each other in the corridors of the Sanctum Imperialis with something new in their golden eyes. Something that looks, if you watch carefully, very much like anticipation. Part 2, the god who was born, not made to understand what the emperor might be capable of, what he might mean if he wakes, what he might do if he speaks. We have to understand what he actually is. Because the answer is stranger and more ancient than most people in the 41st millennium have any idea. The emperor is not a man who became powerful. He did not start as a normal human and gain abilities through training or mutation or exposure to some cosmic force. He was not engineered or created by any civilization humanity knows of. He is something that the universe itself produced, through a process so unlikely and so strange that it has no real parallel anywhere in known lore. Roughly 10,000 years before the events of the 41st millennium, so roughly 20,000 years ago, in terms of the setting's internal chronology, humanity was developing, scattered tribes across the ancient world, and among those tribes, there existed a caste of individuals who were different the shamans, the wise men and women, the people who sat at the border between the material world and whatever lies beyond it. In 40k's framework, these are people with genuine psychic sensitivity, individuals whose minds brush against the immaterial realm that the setting calls the warp without fully falling into it. These ancient shamans understood something. They understood that their kind of gift was dangerous, that a psychic human who died would leave a mark on the warp, a kind of spiritual residue, and that if enough of those marks accumulated in the right way, something catastrophic might emerge from them. The history of the warp is full of exactly that happening. Concentrated spiritual energy coalescing into entities that then enter the world with goals that are not friendly to the beings who created them. So these shamans made a choice that required 10,000 years of preparation and patience, which should tell you something about the kind of minds capable of making it. They gathered from every corner of the ancient world, from cultures that had no other contact with each other. Shamans of genuine power convened and performed a ritual. And in that ritual, they ended themselves, willingly, deliberately, with full understanding of what they were doing, and pooled the totality of their psychic essence into a single, coherent point. Not a random emergence, not a chaotic coalescence, a planned, structured, intentional birth. What emerged from that ritual, in a remote region that would one day be called Anatolia, was an infant boy. He grew, he learned. He walked the ancient world and watched it with eyes that remembered being thousands of different people. He saw civilizations rise and fall. He understood, with a clarity born from the pooled wisdom of countless predecessors, the patterns of human history, the cycles of growth and collapse, the recurring temptations, the predictable failures. He watched empires consume themselves from within and saw the same mistakes made again and again over thousands of years. And unlike the rest of humanity, he couldn't die. This is the part that changes everything. The emperor is what the setting calls a perpetual, a category of being so rare that most people in the 41st millennium don't know the word exists. A perpetual cannot be permanently killed. Inflict whatever wound you like on them, their body will recover. Burn them, dismember them, expose them to the void. They will come back. The process can be agonizing. The recovery can take years or decades, but the soul does not leave. The spark does not extinguish. For the Emperor, this meant 20,000 years of walking among humanity. 20,000 years of watching, learning, guiding from the shadows where he could, waiting for the moment when the shape of history made direct action possible. He has been Revelation, the hero figure that some early human cultures built religions around. He has been the anathema, the figure that chaos has recognized and feared since before those ancient shamans performed their ritual. He has been many names and many faces. There is something almost unbearable about trying to imagine what those 20,000 years were actually like. He began his life watching humanity build the first cities. He watched those cities fall. He watched the rise of the great ancient civilizations and their eventual collapse. He watched the dark age of technology, that period of extraordinary human achievement when humanity spread to the stars and built wonders that the 41st millennium can only envy. And he watched the age of strife that followed it, when the warp storms cut those worlds off from each other, and everything humanity had built was attacked by the very psychic forces that the Emperor had always known were gathering. He watched species-scale catastrophe unfold across a timeline that would span all of recorded human history several times over. And he endured it, stayed the course, kept himself focused on the plan that the shamans had died to make possible. That patience is the quality that distinguishes the Emperor most from every other figure in the setting. Not his power. There are other beings in 40k with comparable or greater raw power, chaos gods and ancient elder constructs and things older still. Not his intelligence, though he is extraordinarily intelligent, but the patience, the 20,000-year willingness to wait for the right moment, to keep the goal in view across timescales that should make goal orientation impossible, to accept the suffering of the short term for the possibility of the long term. That same patience is what he is deploying now on the throne. 10,000 years is a long time to anyone but him, but he has always been building towards something. By the time humanity reached the stars, the Emperor had a plan. It was a plan on the scale of civilizations, a plan that required accepting enormous short-term suffering for the possibility of long-term survival. And the core of that plan was this: humanity needed to be united under rational, enlightened leadership before the galaxy's other dangers, and specifically before the entities that lurk in the warp could make that unity impossible. The Great Crusade was the execution of that plan, with 20-odd demigod sons called Primarchs as his generals, with the early Adeptus Astartes as his shock troops. With the Mechanicum providing the industrial backbone, the Emperor set out to bring every surviving human civilization back under one flag. Not through gentle persuasion where it could be avoided. The galaxy is not a place that rewards gentleness. Through force where necessary, and through the deliberate dismantling of the religious structures that he believed kept humanity spiritually vulnerable. He was, at his core, a rationalist, a humanist. In the original sense of the word, someone who believed in the potential of human beings to achieve extraordinary things through their own efforts and intelligence, without need for divine assistance or spiritual crutches. The imperial truth, as his philosophy was called, held that the gods of humanity's many religions were not real, or if they had some form of existence in the warp, they were not worthy of worship. They were parasites feeding on human belief. He was correct about the dangers of warp entities. He was deeply wrong, or at least deeply incomplete, about humanity's ability to go cold turkey on religion in the space of a generation or two. He was correct about the dangers of warp entities. He was deeply wrong, or at least deeply incomplete, about humanity's ability to go cold turkey on religion in the space of a generation or two. The things that humanity calls gods are genuinely dangerous in the 40k universe. The ruinous powers are real. Faith directed at them feeds them directly. But the Emperor's solution: eliminate all supernatural belief, rely entirely on rational structures, failed to account for the fact that humans under existential pressure will always reach for meaning beyond the purely material. When the heresy came and the Emperor was destroyed and the universe fell into darkness, the people left behind needed something to hold on to. They needed him to be more than a very powerful man who was now dead. They needed him to be a god. And so the imperial cult was born, not from cynical manipulation, not from the scheming of priests who knew it was false and built it anyway. From genuine human need, genuine human grief, genuine human terror in the face of a galaxy that was now demonstrably trying to kill them without the Emperor standing in the way. The faith is real. It has always been real. And in the 40k universe, where faith has genuine metaphysical weight and the emotional state of billions of minds genuinely shapes the warp, that faith has consequences that go far beyond institutional politics. Some argue that the Emperor himself might now draw power from that faith. That the billions of prayers directed at him every day, accumulating in the warp as genuine psychic energy, might be sustaining him in ways that nothing else could. That the thing the Emperor explicitly rejected during his lifetime, being worshipped as a god, is now the mechanism by which he survives. If true, this is one of the most profound ironies in a setting defined by them, and his plan fractured, not because of an external enemy, not because of some cosmic force beyond his anticipation, but because of betrayal at the most intimate possible level. His favorite son, perhaps his most gifted creation, the War Master Horus, was corrupted by the very forces the Emperor had spent his entire existence trying to protect humanity from. The Horus heresy shattered everything. The Great Crusade became a civil war. Primarchs fought Primarchs. Space Marine chapters turned their weapons on their brothers. Terror itself was besieged. And in the final confrontation aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor came face to face with what Horus had become, not just a corrupted man, but a vessel for the combined power of all four Chaos gods, a weapon of unimaginable metaphysical force aimed directly at the soul of humanity's greatest champion. The Emperor won. He destroyed what Horus had become, burned away every trace of corruption, ended the heresy with a single act of psychic force so immense that left marks in the warp visible across the galaxy. But the cost was everything. His body was destroyed past any mortal reckoning, his flesh and organs obliterated, his physical form reduced to something that should not have been able to support consciousness at all. And yet the spark did not go out. Because perpetuals don't die, even like this. Even now, his broken form was carried back to Terra by Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who reportedly wept when he saw what had been done to his father. And in the deepest chamber of the Imperial Palace, something was waiting that had never been intended for this purpose. Part 3. The throne that was never meant to be a throne. This is where a lot of people get the story wrong, and it matters enormously for understanding the Emperor's current situation. The Golden Throne is not a life support machine. It was never built to be a life support machine. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been maintaining it for 10,000 years, performing sacred rites over its mechanisms, treating it as the most holy object in the entire Imperium. And the extraordinary irony is that most of them don't truly understand what it is, what it was built to do, or what it actually needs to function properly. The Golden Throne is a portal. Specifically, it is a device built during the dark age of technology, that pre-heresy era when humanity's scientific understanding was at its peak, to interface with the webway. The webway, for those less familiar, is the ancient tunnel network built by the Elder and their predecessors across the galaxy. It is a system of passages through the immaterium, through the warp, that is enclosed, stable, and shielded from the nightmare entities that make conventional warp travel so dangerous. It is, in essence, a transit network that bypasses the most terrible aspects of warp travel. The Emperor wanted access to the webway for humanity, not just because it would make travel faster and safer, though it would do both, but because a humanity that could move through the webway without using conventional warp drives would be a humanity that was far less spiritually exposed to the predatory entities of chaos. Every time a ship enters the warp through conventional means, it brushes against something. Every navigator who steers through the Sea of Souls is touching, however briefly, a dimension where thought has consequence and dark things are always watching. Over thousands of years, those contacts accumulate. They leave marks on the human soul, collectively speaking. The webway bypasses all of that. Move through the webway and you are in an enclosed, maintained tunnel. The darkness on the other side of the walls cannot reach you. For a species with the psychic potential of humanity, this is not a minor logistical advantage. It is potentially civilizationally transformative. So the Emperor built the Golden Throne as an interface device. A machine that would allow him to sit at the nexus of the network, to pour his own psychic power into the ancient Elder infrastructure, and maintain a stable passage through it, slowly expanding humanity's access, He had been working on this project in secret, beneath the Imperial Palace, for years. It was his great private project, his gift to humanity's future. And then Magnus the Red came to him with a warning. Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, and perhaps the most gifted psyker among all the Primarchs, had discovered the conspiracy forming around Horus. Desperate to warn his father, unable to reach him through conventional means quickly enough, he did the only thing he could think of. He sent a psychic message directly to Terra, a message of enormous power carried on wings of pure warp energy. The message got through, but the passage it used was the webway extension the Emperor had been building, and the titanic force of Magnus's sending shattered the psychic wards and barriers the Emperor had spent years constructing around that passage. The careful, controlled interface he had been building cracked open, and through that crack poured the contents of the warp. Daemons flooded into the extension. The project was compromised, the carefully maintained tunnel destabilized, and the Emperor was forced to abandon the webway project and take up position on the Golden Throne to seal the breach before the daemonic incursion reached Terra. He sat down on the throne to deal with an emergency. He has never been able to get up. That is the horror at the heart of the Golden Throne. The Emperor is not sitting there because that is the best way to serve humanity. He is not in some transcendent meditative state by choice, touching the minds of billions and guiding the Imperium with invisible hands. He is locked in an unending psychic battle against the pressure of the warp, pushing through that crack, fighting every single moment to hold the breach closed, to power the Astronomicon, to keep the lights on across 100,000 worlds, while simultaneously dying, extremely slowly, of injuries that would have killed any being in the universe centuries ago. He is the most powerful psychic entity in the history of humanity, and he is pinned. The life support functions were added later, frantically, by his greatest engineers and the most skilled tech adepts they could find, to keep the biological remnants of his body viable, while his consciousness did the work that could not stop even for a moment. The machine he is now connected to is an improvised solution to a catastrophe, jury rigged around a device that was meant for an entirely different purpose. The tech priests who maintain it now, those devoted servants of the cult Mechanicus who spend their lives in the chambers around the throne, performing maintenance rites and murmuring prayers to the machine spirit within, are in many cases working from corrupted or incomplete technical manuals. The full understanding of how the Golden Throne functions, the design principles behind it, the specific requirements it has for materials and maintenance and calibration, was largely lost in the fires of the Horus heresy and the centuries of chaos that followed. The tech priests who maintain it now, those devoted servants of the cult Mechanicus who spend their lives in the chambers around the throne, performing maintenance rites and murmuring prayers to the machine spirit within, are in many cases working from corrupted or incomplete technical manuals. The full understanding of how the Golden Throne functions, the design principles behind it, the specific requirements it has for materials and maintenance and calibration, was largely lost in the fires of the Horus heresy and the centuries of chaos that followed. Consider what that means in practice. Imagine that the most important machine in the history of your civilization was built using manufacturing techniques that no longer exist. The materials required for its specific components cannot be sourced, because the knowledge of how to make them was destroyed. The engineers who designed it are dead. The only documentation available is a partial copy of a copy, damaged in transit, with entire sections missing. And this machine has been running continuously for 10,000 years, and it cannot be turned off even for maintenance, because turning it off would immediately kill the entity. It is sustaining and extinguish the beacon that 100,000 worlds depend on for navigation. That is the situation the Adeptus Mechanicus faces with the Golden Throne. Every repair is an improvisation. Every maintenance cycle is performed using substitute materials that are close to correct but not correct, by people who understand roughly what the machine does, but not precisely how it does it. The accumulated effect of 10,000 years of such improvisation is a machine that still functions, but that is increasingly fragile in ways that are very difficult to evaluate, because the baseline reference for healthy function was lost millennia ago. They are maintaining the most important machine in the history of the human species using partial documentation and religious ritual, and it is failing. This is not speculation. This is not a fringe theory held by radical magi. The evidence has been building for centuries, confirmed most recently in the investigations depicted in Danny Ware and Guy Haley's novel Vaults of Terror. The Dark City, the Golden Throne, is degrading. Its mechanisms are showing signs of wear that cannot be reversed with existing knowledge and existing materials. The projections, based on its current rate of deterioration, give it roughly 100 years before it fails catastrophically. 100 years. For a civilization that has been running for 10,000 years, 100 years is a heartbeat. When the Fabricator General of Mars, the head of the Adeptus Mechanicus, one of the most powerful individuals in the Imperium, discovered the true scope of this crisis and began pursuing what he believed was the only solution, he was murdered for it. Not by enemies, by allies, by people who could not afford to let the truth of the throne's condition become known, because the political and social consequences of that knowledge becoming public would be catastrophic. The man responsible for maintaining the most sacred object in imperial faith is dead, killed by the institution he served. Because the machine he was trying to save is broken in ways that no one left alive fully knows how to fix. That is where things stand. The Emperor is on a throne that was never meant to hold him. The throne is falling apart. The people maintaining it are working in the dark, and the clock is ticking. But before we get to what that crisis means for the present day, we need to spend some time with the silence itself. Because 10,000 years of the Emperor's absence has done something to the Imperium that goes deeper than any machine failure. It has made the Imperium into something the Emperor himself might not recognize. And some of the most fascinating, most heartbreaking moments in recent 40k lore about exactly that moment of recognition. The people close enough to the throne to get a sense of what it contains, confronting the gap between the Emperor they worship and the being they are actually dealing with. Part 4: 10,000 years of what it costs to run a galaxy picture an hourglass. Not a decorative object on a mantelpiece, but something the size of a continent, filled not with sand but with human lives. Every few seconds, one falls through. Every few seconds, somewhere in the Imperium a psyker dies, burned up, drained to nothing, consumed by the psychic machinery that keeps everything running. Every day, roughly 1,000 souls are fed into the Golden Throne to fuel the Astronomicon alone. In recent decades, as the throne's efficiency has degraded, that number has had to be increased significantly. The maths are not comfortable. 4,000 years ago, the number of psykers required was lower. The throne was in better condition. The barrier between the warp and real space was more stable. The flow of navigable routes through the Immaterium was steadier. The whole psychic infrastructure of the Imperium ran on less fuel. Now it requires more, and the supply is strained. The psykers fed to the throne are not meaningless statistics. They are human beings, most of them untrained individuals who discovered their gifts too late or in the wrong circumstances, collected by the black ships, those vast, grim vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that sweep through imperial space gathering dangerous psychic individuals before they can harm themselves or their communities. Some of them were healers in their villages. Some were children who made things float when they got frightened. Some were old men and women who could feel the emotions of their neighbors and spent their whole lives trying to hide it. They end up in the chambers beneath the imperial palace, and they are used up, and their essence flows into the machine, and the Astronomicon burns a little longer. But here is something that almost no one inside the setting is permitted to think about clearly. What if the Emperor knows about every one of them? What if a consciousness that exists simultaneously in the material world and in the warp, that has been sitting at the nexus of the psychic infrastructure of the Imperium for 10,000 years, is aware of each sacrifice as it happens? What if the silence is not the silence of someone who doesn't know the cost of his survival, but of someone who knows it precisely, who feels it, and who has nonetheless made the calculation that holding on is the only possible option? That is not a comfortable thought. But in a setting that doesn't traffic in comfortable thoughts, it might be the honest one. The High Lords of Terror have debated, over the centuries, whether this is a sustainable model. The debates are recorded in documents so classified that most of them are effectively lost. The answer, in every case, has been some variation of it is not sustainable, but there is no alternative we are capable of implementing, so we continue. Meanwhile, the galaxy is getting worse. The warp is not a static environment. It responds to the emotional state of the beings whose psychic emanations bleed into it. 10,000 years of war, and there has been war somewhere in the Imperium, every single day of those 10,000 years, have made the warp increasingly turbulent. The entities that dwell within it are stronger, better fed, more present. The barriers that separate real space from the immaterial are thinner in many places than they were at the end of the heresy. The tide of demonic incursions has been increasing. The frequency of warp storms has been increasing. The number of worlds that have been lost, simply cut off from the rest of the Imperium by barriers of warp energy that no ship can safely cross, has been slowly, steadily increasing. The Imperium is an empire that has been under constant siege for 10,000 years, and it is not winning. The erosion is visible in metrics that the High Lords track and that the Inquisition monitors with quiet alarm. The number of worlds that fall to chaos, to Xeno's invasion, to internal heresy, to simple economic collapse or environmental catastrophe, has been gradually outpacing the number of new worlds brought into compliance. The net total of human-controlled space in the galaxy has been slowly, almost imperceptibly, shrinking. Not dramatically. The Imperium is vast, and vast things take a long time to diminish. But the trend line, viewed over centuries rather than decades, is unmistakable. There is a phrase that circulates in certain inquisitorial circles, spoken quietly, and only among those with the security clearance to hear it without the duty to report it: the long defeat. The idea that the Imperium is not an empire fighting for survival, but an empire managing its own slow collapse, trading space and resources and population for time, buying decades with centuries of blood. Not because anyone chose that strategy, but because no one has ever found an alternative that is both feasible and sufficient to reverse the trend. The Emperor, alive and active and directing the Great Crusade, reversed the trend. That is the one demonstrated historical data point. When he was present and engaged, humanity expanded. When he left, or was removed, humanity contracted. The connection is not complicated. This is also why the silence is so corrosive. Humanity's greatest psychic entity should be fighting back, should be guiding, should be doing something. If not for his own sake, then for the sake of the hundreds of billions who depend on him. The silence is not the silence of a detached philosophical observer. It is the silence of someone who may be losing, or, and this is the possibility that the optimists hold on to, someone who is waiting. The universe of 40k runs on faith, and the faith of the Imperium has always had at its heart a hope that feels almost too fragile to voice, that the Emperor is not simply holding on, not merely surviving, but planning. That the 10,000 years of apparent silence are not emptiness but preparation. That when the moment comes, when the crisis deepens to whatever threshold he is waiting for, he will act. There is evidence, scattered and fragmentary and easy to dismiss, that this hope is not entirely without foundation. The Emperor has communicated, not in words, not in the way that a living man communicates with the people around him, but in the way that an entity whose consciousness spans an entire dimension of reality might communicate, obliquely, through impressions and images and emotional resonances, through the psychic medium of the warp itself. The most dramatic documented instance is the meeting between the reborn Primarch Robert Guilliman and the Emperor, depicted in the novel Dark Imperium by Guy Haley. Guilliman, brought back from the edge of death by the elder god Unid and rearmored in the new armor of fate, went to the throne room. He asked questions. He wanted guidance, wanted understanding, wanted something to hold on to in the face of the catastrophe unfolding around him. What he received was not conversation. It was a psychic detonation, a blast of images and intentions and emotional resonances so powerful that it knocked him physically backward. The throne room was full of custodians, those warrior guardians who devote their entire lives to the Emperor's service, and every one of them turned to look. They heard something. They felt the shift in the room's psychic atmosphere. Something had happened, but Guilliman emerged from that encounter deeply shaken, not comforted, not guided with clarity, shaken. In the way that a man is shaken, who has touched something immense and alien, and realized that the thing he touched has been changed by 10,000 years in ways that he is not equipped to fully understand. In one version of events recorded in the lore, Guilliman reportedly said afterward that the Emperor was still aware, still present, still fighting.
Okay, I want to step out the lore for just a second and be real with you, because this is the part of the topic that genuinely gets me. I've been reading 40k for a long time, and most of it is designed to feel hopeless. That's the whole point, right? That's the aesthetic. But the Emperor's story is the one place where I actually feel something that I'd call genuine tension. Like, not just, oh no, will the good guys win tension, but something closer to the feeling you get at the end of a really long book when you're not sure if the author is going to give you the ending you've been hoping for the whole time or pull the rug out. Because here's my honest take. I think Games Workshop is building towards something real here. And I don't think this is just fan wishful thinking. The Star Child, the Psychic Awakening, ciphers, not yet. The Custodians going out the galaxy for the first time. That's too many specific, deliberate pieces pointing the same direction to be nothing. But I also think, knowing this setting, that even if the Emperor does return, it's not going to feel like a victory. It's going to be complicated and painful, and it's going to ask more of the characters before than anything that came before. But anyways, I also want to apologize about the quality of the audio. I'm running into some problems. I will get that fixed very soon. Alright, let's get back to the video.
But that the being he encountered bore only a partial resemblance to the father he remembered. That 10,000 years of psychic battle against the forces of chaos, 10,000 years of holding the breach, 10,000 years of existing simultaneously in the material world and the warp had altered him, deepened him, perhaps, or damaged him, or possibly both, in ways that cannot be separated. Guilliman doesn't talk about it publicly. Not really. The Primarch who returned to lead humanity's armies, who issued the Edict of Reformation and reorganized the Adeptus Astartes, and drove back the forces of the Plague God from Ultramar, carries whatever he learned in that throne room with him and keeps it very close. It surfaces occasionally in his private journals, some of which have found their way into the lore, as expressions of doubt, of grief, of a man trying to reconcile his love for his father with what his father has become. That private grief, visible in the most powerful individual in the current Imperium, tells you something important about what 10,000 years of silence actually means on a personal level. But even in that silence, even in that gulf between the Emperor of the Crusade and whatever the Golden Throne now holds, things are being communicated. Not clearly, not reliably. But the channel is not entirely dead, and in recent years, in the era of the Dark Imperium, the era after the Great Rift tore the galaxy apart, that channel has been getting louder, slowly, intermittently, in ways that could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking by those who choose to dismiss them. But louder. Part 5. The Fall of Cadia and the Galaxy That Broke. There is an argument to be made that Warhammer 40,000 as a setting has always been apocalyptic. That from the very first edition, it was a universe of endless war and creeping darkness and civilizations holding on by their fingernails. And that argument is correct. But there is also a meaningful distinction between the kind of slow-motion apocalypse that characterized the setting for decades and what happened around the year 999 of the 41st millennium. What happened then was different in kind, not just in degree. Cadia was a fortress world. That barely captures what it was. Cadia was the cork in the bottle. It sat at the edge of the Eye of Terror, that vast, permanent scar in the fabric of reality where the warp bleeds directly into the material galaxy over a region of space that would take months to traverse even at FTL speeds. The Eye had existed since the fall of the Eldar, since the birth scream of a new chaos god had punched a hole through the barrier between realities that had never fully closed. For 10,000 years, Cadia and a handful of other fortress worlds in the Cadian Gate had held that passage against the tide of darkness that pressed eternally outward. Every major chaos incursion of any consequence that came out of the Eye had to come through or near Cadia. The planet was literally designed for defense. Its population was born into the military, trained from childhood, producing soldiers at a rate that kept entire sectors of the Imperium supplied with elite infantry. The Cadian shock troops were among the most respected forces in the Imperial Guard for exactly this reason. They had been fighting the most dangerous war in the galaxy their entire lives, and so had their parents and their parents' parents, generation after generation. Then Abaddon the Despoiler came with the 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon Ezekiel, formerly the first captain of the Lunar Wolves, Horus's right hand during the heresy, had spent 10,000 years leading assault after assault out of the Eye of Terror. 12 times before, he had brought chaos forces against the Cadian Gate. 12 times, at enormous cost on both sides, the fortress worlds had held. Some viewed this as evidence that Abaddon was somehow incompetent, that the Despoiler was all image and no substance. They were wrong. The previous crusades had each achieved specific objectives: recovering artifacts, weakening specific defenses, testing responses, learning. The 13th was the one that all the previous 12 had been preparing for. He came with a weapon unlike anything the Imperium had encountered: a blackstone fortress. These ancient, pre-imperial constructs, each one a moon-sized war machine of unimaginable power, were capable of destabilizing stars. Abaddon used one of them to tear apart Cadia's structural integrity directly, bypassing its defenses entirely. When the Blackstone Fortress fell on Cadia, the planet broke. Not metaphorically. The tectonic structure of the world was fractured. The pylons, those mysterious black obelisks of unknown construction that had stood across Cadia's surface since before humanity settled the world and that, it turned out, had been actively suppressing the warp all along, were destroyed. The barrier that Cadia had represented, physical and metaphysical, at once collapsed. Cadia fell. And then something happened that was orders of magnitude worse than the fall of even that critical world. The Eye of Terror expanded. The tear in reality that had been contained behind the Cadian gate for 10,000 years began to grow. And not just from the Eye. From multiple points simultaneously across the galaxy. Other warp breaches that had been slowly expanding suddenly connected. The expanding Eye met the maelstrom. Other smaller tears linked up. A chain reaction rippled across galactic space, and the Immaterium flooded into the material universe in quantities that hadn't been seen since the fall of the Eldar. The result was the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a wound across the sky of the entire galaxy, stretching from one edge to the other in a ragged diagonal slash, dividing human space into two halves, the Imperium Sanctus on one side, where the light of the Astronomicon still reached, and the Imperium Nihilus on the other side, where it didn't. Half the Imperium went dark, not figuratively, for a period estimated at 3 days by Terra's timekeepers, though the timekeeping itself became unreliable due to local warp distortions. Even the Sanctus side of the galaxy lost the Astronomicon. The Golden Throne's beacon, which had been burning continuously for 10,000 years, went out, or seemed to. Those 33 days are called the Noctis Aeterna, the long night. On worlds across the Imperium, people woke up and looked at the sky and saw that the familiar star pattern was wrong. On worlds where the Astronomicon was part of daily navigation, ships sat in port because no navigator could find a safe route. In the deepest chambers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on Terra, astropaths who had been trained to feel the warmth of the Emperor's light their entire professional lives found themselves standing in the cold for the first time. Then the Astronomicon came back, brighter than before. This is one of the most significant events in recent 40k lore, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. The light returned stronger than it had been. Whatever had happened in those 33 days, whatever had been going on in the Golden Throne, whatever process had played out in the psychic space between the Emperor and the catastrophe now dividing his Imperium, the result was not a weakening. The Astronomicon that blazed back to life in the aftermath of the Noctis Aeterna was more powerful than the one that had gone out. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica noticed. The custodians noticed. Those few individuals with the psychic sensitivity and the institutional access to compare before and after noticed. Something in the throne had changed, or something in the Emperor had changed, or, most intriguingly, something had been done. Something deliberate, something active, not the passive burning on of a machine set to run, but the purposeful act of a consciousness that had decided, in that critical moment, to reach deeper. No official explanation was ever issued. The High Lords of Terror, when pressed on the subject of the Noctis Aeterna, categorized it as a temporary anomaly caused by the psychic disruption of the Cicatrix Maledictum, and stated that the Emperor's light had never truly faltered. This is, by any technical measure, a lie. The astropathic records are clear, the navigator testimony is clear, but the lie serves a political purpose that the High Lords considered more important than accuracy. They could not afford for the Imperium to know that the Astronomicon had gone dark. They could not afford the questions that would follow. But the questions were asked anyway, in private, by people with enough knowledge and access to understand what they had observed, and the most interesting answers circled around a possibility that no one in a position of authority wanted to say out loud. Maybe the Emperor had been doing something on purpose. Maybe the dark was part of a plan. Part 6 Days of Darkness, and what the psychic awakening actually means. Not long after the Great Rift opened, something else began to happen. Something that built slowly, that could be dismissed at first as coincidence or statistical noise, but that eventually accumulated into a pattern too consistent to ignore. human psychers started being born more frequently. This is significant. The ratio of psychically gifted individuals in the human population has never been entirely stable. It drifts with circumstances, with local warp conditions, with the psychic history of a specific planetary population. But the kind of shift that began appearing in the data after the opening of the Great Rift was not a drift. It was a surge. On world after world, in region after region, the reports came in more psychers, stronger psychers, children manifesting abilities at younger ages, adult psychers developing capabilities that their training frameworks hadn't anticipated, untrained individuals holding themselves together without guidance in circumstances that should have seen them spiral into daemonic possession. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica officially described this as a concerning crisis, a dangerous proliferation of psychic wild talents that would require increased black ship activity to manage. That framing is not entirely wrong. More untrained psychers in a galaxy that has just had a second major hole punched through to the warp is genuinely dangerous, and people have genuinely died as a result. But something else was also happening within that surge. Something visible only to those willing to look at the full picture, rather than the danger management subset of it. The nature of the psychic gift itself seemed to be changing, stabilizing, in some cases. Spontaneous healers who would formerly have burned themselves out within months were sustaining. Seers whose visions should have been incoherent fragments were receiving what appeared to be structured information. Astropaths who had spent decades maintaining barely adequate communications were reporting sudden improvements in clarity and range. The term that came to describe this broader phenomenon was the psychic awakening. In the game narrative, across an entire series of books released through the later part of 8th edition, it unfolded as a series of interconnected events touching almost every major faction in the setting. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters faced new and terrifying expressions of the flaw, that genetic legacy of Sanguinius's fall that manifests in his sons as bloodlust and visions of death. The Space Wolves encountered something in the Fenrisian warp that resonated with their oldest myths. The Yunari, those Eldar who follow the nascent god of the dead, became more active, their own power growing in ways that paralleled the human changes. The Necrons stirred. Even the Tau, who have minimal warp presence and have historically existed somewhat outside the psychic politics of the setting, found themselves drawn into the implications of the new psychic landscape. But at its core was a single question: what was driving it? The official ecclesiarchy position was straightforward. This was the Emperor's blessing, evidence of his favor during a dark time, a gift to his faithful in their hour of need. The more cautious scientific voices in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica suggested that the psychic nature of the Great Rift itself was contaminating the human gene pool in ways that manifested as increased psychic potential. A view with some validity, but that explains the contamination without explaining the directional stability. Chaos corrupted areas produce maddened, uncontrolled psychers. The psychic awakening produced something different. It produced psychers who were, many of them, oriented toward the light. There is a specific event from the psychic awakening era that illustrates this clearly. During Guilliman's campaign to retake Ultramar from the Death Guard, the Plague, Marines of Nurgle, the Chaos god of decay and entropy, there was an encounter involving a girl, an ordinary girl, unaffiliated with any inquisitorial or ecclesiarchy institution, who was found in the ruins of a settlement that had been overrun by Nurgle's forces. She should have been dead. The Plague god's influence had seeped into the environment so completely that untainted humans had a life expectancy measured in hours in those conditions. She had been there for days, and she was not merely alive. She was a point of psychic stillness in a storm of corruption, a quiet center around which the daemonic forces swirled without touching her. When chaos entities came near her, they recoiled. They called her a word in their own terrible language. The word meant anathema. It is the same title by which the beings of the warp refer to the Emperor himself. She was not a saint, in the technical ecclesiarchy sense. She had not performed miracles in any documented way that could be formally processed. She was not yet another figure for the church to argue about canonizing. She was just a girl who was, somehow, suffused with a kind of psychic aura that functioned exactly like a significantly reduced version of the Emperor's own presence. The quality that makes the chaos powers genuinely fear him. The quality that makes the warp distort around him. The quality that makes daemons who would gleefully tear a space marine apart actually back away. How does an ordinary girl in a plague-ridden ruin have that? How does she have something that, in all of 40k's long history, only the Emperor has been documented to possess? One answer, the easy answer, the one the ecclesiarchy would leap to, is that she was blessed by the Emperor in some direct, personal way, that he reached down from his throne and touched her. Another answer, stranger but perhaps more interesting, is that she was not uniquely blessed, but rather a symptom of something broader happening in the human psychic field. That the Emperor's influence was not diminishing but spreading, not breaking down but dispersing into the population in minute quantities. Seeding something. This connects to a theory about the Emperor's long-term plan that we will get to shortly. But first, let us keep building the picture of the present day, because the miracle of one girl in Ultramar is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern that, once you start looking for it, shows up everywhere. The Saints' Wall on Benediction. That holy world, deeply significant to the ecclesiarchy, came under attack from chaos forces during the period of the Psychic Awakening. At the moment when the planet's final defenses seemed about to collapse, something happened at the great holy site that the defenders had been attempting to protect. Light emerged from it. Not a searchlight or a flare. Light with no obvious source. Light that burned through armored Chaos Marines without causing the kind of damage that any weapon creates. Light that had specifically spiritual and metaphysical effects on the demonic entities leading the assault. The assault collapsed. The world held. The custodians of the Blood Pact, militant defenders of Benediction, made their reports. The Inquisition investigated. The ecclesiarchy celebrated and began the canonization process for 3 of the individuals present who had been closest to whatever had occurred. What had occurred was never formally explained. The inquisitorial report, insofar as one exists in accessible form, describes it as an anomalous psychic event of class absolute, which is inquisitorial classification for. We have no established framework for what this was, and we're not going to speculate in writing. But the seers who were consulted in the aftermath, those trained psychics whose job is specifically to interpret events in the warp's aftermath, said something privately that did not make it into official reports. They said that the warp in the immediate region around Benediction had, during those moments, carried an impression. A vast, distant impression. The kind of thing that is felt rather than seen. That leaves no evidence that any instrument can quantify. But that is recognizable to a trained psychic sensitivity, the way you might recognize a close friend's voice in a crowd, even if you can't quite make out the words. The impression they felt was the Emperor's. Not a miracle delivered by a distant mechanism, not an automated defense system responding to an emergency, not a saint acting as a proxy. The actual Emperor, or some fraction of his consciousness, turning attention briefly toward Benediction at the moment when it mattered most and doing something about what he found there. That is not how a dying, barely conscious prisoner held captive by a failing life support machine behaves. That is how a strategist operating on a timeline larger than human comprehension behaves. Part 7. The Primarch who stood before his father. There are very few people alive in the 41st millennium who have seen the Emperor. Not the paintings, not the icons, not the statues that line every imperial building from frontier hive to palace corridor. The actual person, the body, whatever remains of it on the throne. Entry to the Sanctum Imperialis is controlled with an absoluteness that makes the most secure vaults in the Imperium look like open doorways. The 10,000, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, do not permit access. The High Lords of Terror do not have the right to simply walk in. Even the highest-ranking cardinals of the ecclesiarchy, whose entire religion is built around the Emperor, have not stood in that room. There are exceptions. There have always been exceptions, managed with extraordinary care. Robout Guilliman is the most significant of those exceptions in the current era. To understand why this meeting matters so much, why it carries the weight it does in the narrative of modern 40k, you have to understand who Guilliman is now versus who he was before. He is not the same Primarch who served during the Great Crusade. The 10,000 years of absence have not touched him personally. He was frozen in stasis during that time, hovering between life and death in a crystalline tomb on Macragge, preserved by forces that held his mortal wound at bay but could not heal it. But the 10,000 years have touched everything and everyone he knew. When he woke, his brothers were dead or corrupted or missing. His father was broken. His Imperium had become a thing so far removed from the vision he had fought to build that encountering it for the first time was, by all accounts, a genuinely traumatic experience. He was a man from a rational, progressive civilization who had just woken up in a medieval theocracy that bore his name on its lips as a religious invocation. He went to the throne. The novel Dark Imperium gives us the most direct account of this encounter. Guilliman entered the Sanctum Imperialis. The custodians stepped aside for him. Because one of the few things that will make the 10,000 step aside is a Primarch walking toward the door with intent. He walked into the presence of what the Golden Throne contained. What he found defies easy description, because what it contains defies easy description. The throne itself is a massive structure of gold and brass and obsidian, ancient beyond reckoning, humming with psychic resonance. Cables and tubes and mechanisms beyond the ken of any living tech. Priest connect it to the infrastructure of the palace. And at its center, held in the throne's embrace, is something that a casual observer might struggle to recognize as a human body. The Emperor's physical form has been sustained beyond any reasonable limit. It is not a healthy body. It is not a strong body. It is something that exists because the consciousness within it refuses to release its grip on physicality, and because thousands of years of psychic maintenance have held the biological material together through means that no purely physical medicine could accomplish. And the consciousness within it was aware of Guilliman. The description from Guilliman's perspective is of an immense presence, something that fills a space far larger than the physical dimensions of the throne room, something that extends into senses that a normal human doesn't possess but a Primarch does. His psychic sensitivity, which is considerable, was overwhelmed almost immediately. He experienced what might best be described as a direct data transfer, rather than a conversation. Impressions and images and emotional resonances flooding into him faster than language can carry thought, bypassing the structures of communication and going straight to the level of meaning. He received awareness of the scale of the threat. He received something that might have been encouragement, or might have been an acknowledgement of his role in a plan he could only partially see. He received, most devastatingly, a glimpse of what the Emperor had become. The vast, strange, alien quality of a consciousness that had been fighting the warp from the inside for 10,000 years. He came out changed, not corrupted, not damaged in any way that the custodians or his own staff could identify, but changed in the way that people change when they have encountered something so much larger than themselves that it reframes everything. He emerged from that meeting a man who had found both confirmation and loss simultaneously. Confirmation that his father was still there, still fighting, still in some sense present, and loss in the recognition of how much of the father he remembered was no longer accessible. How much of the conversation he had hoped to have was simply impossible, because the being on the throne was no longer a being whose mind worked in the patterns of ordinary discourse. What Guilliman said afterward, in private, that most closely captures his reaction, and this comes from his journal entries as depicted in the novels, was something to the effect that he had spoken to his father and been answered, and that the answer had told him everything he needed to know in terms of his purpose and his duty, and nothing he had hoped to hear in terms of comfort or companionship. There is a particular passage from Guilliman's recorded thoughts, paraphrased through the novel rather than directly quoted, that captures something essential about what the experience was like for him. He had gone in expecting to find his father, the architect, the strategist, the man who had raised demigods and built an interstellar empire from nothing, the person who knew him better than any other being in the history of the species. He went in hoping for a conversation, perhaps not a long one, perhaps not a comfortable one, but a conversation. Some exchange that would give him guidance for the decisions ahead, some acknowledgement of what he was trying to do, some sense of whether he was getting it right. What he received instead was vastness, a presence so expanded beyond its original dimensions that the human-scaled qualities he had come looking for were present only as overtones in something much larger, the way a single instrument's voice exists inside the sound of a full orchestra, but cannot be individually distinguished once the orchestra is playing at full volume. The Emperor was in there, but finding him, finding the specific person Guilliman had known, required navigating through everything that 10,000 years had added to him, everything that the endless psychic battle and the slow transformation and the weight of 10,000 years of humanity's combined prayer had made him into. It is like going home after a long absence and finding that the house you knew is still there, but every room has been added to, extended, built upon, until the original structure is somewhere in the middle of something much larger that you do not know your way around. The home you remember is in there, but getting to it requires passing through everything that has been built since. That is the loneliness at the heart of Guilliman's return, and it is one of the most genuinely affecting things in current 40k lore. He came back from 10,000 years of absence hoping, on some level, that his father would still be there in a way that would make reunion possible. And the Emperor is there, present, aware, vast. But the version of him that could have been a father to Guilliman, in the emotional sense he needed, is inaccessible, hidden behind 10,000 years of transformation. But here is the thing that Guilliman also reported, the thing that matters most for our discussion. There was a sense of intent in that communication. Not confusion, not blind reaction, not the last gasps of a dying consciousness burning its remaining fuel on one final transmission. Intent, purpose, a being that knew what it was doing, knew why, and was doing it on a timeline that extended beyond anything its servant, strategist Primarch, could fully grasp. The Emperor was not dying towards some random endpoint. He was working towards something. The question is what? And the answer requires us to dig into one of the most fascinating and least discussed corners of 40k lore. A theory so old that it predates the current edition of the game by decades. A possibility so strange and so significant that the forces of chaos actively try to prevent it. A concept so central to what the Emperor might actually become that understanding it changes everything about how you read the current state of the setting. The Star Child. Part 8. The Star Child. The Emperor's most ancient secret of all the mysteries in Warhammer 40,000, and there are many, stacked upon each other like the layers of civilization built over ancient terror. The mystery of the Star Child is the one that has the most profound implications for the question of the Emperor's possible return. It is also, frustratingly, one of the most obscure pieces of lore, buried in old sourcebooks and newer novels in ways that make it easy to miss if you haven't specifically gone looking for it. Here is the core of it. When the Emperor confronted Horus on the Vengeful Spirit, he faced something unprecedented. Horus had become a vessel for chaos itself, the combined power of all four Runus powers flowing through him. He was not merely a corrupted space marine. He was, at that moment, one of the most powerful concentrations of warp energy in the history of the setting. Killing him required the Emperor to do something extraordinary. To direct a force of psychic power against Horus of such magnitude that it would burn through all four layers of daemonic corruption and reach the human soul beneath it, the last tiny fragment of the Warmaster Horus that remained, and destroy even that, leave nothing that could be recovered or used. To do that, the Emperor had to open himself completely. He had to access every aspect of his psychic power without reservation, without limit, without the careful controls he normally maintained on his own capabilities. And in doing so, he shed something. The Emperor's nature, even before the heresy, was not simple. He was the pooled essence of thousands of ancient shamans, amplified and shaped by 20,000 years of additional experience and growth. Within that consciousness were many things: wisdom, certainly, and power, certainly, but also something that the Chaos powers had always found particularly dangerous about him. Something they actively worked to contain and prevent from growing. The Emperor has always carried what might be called his divine spark, not in the religious sense, but in the literal sense. A component of his psychic nature that is pure in a way that the Chaos powers cannot touch or corrupt, that represents the highest expression of human potential. That is the genuine core of what he is at his most fundamental. Call it compassion if you want a single word, or love, or the absolute commitment to the survival and flourishing of humanity, not as an abstract political project, but as an emotional truth. That quality, that specific, irreducible quality, is what makes the Chaos gods afraid of him. They have vast power over corruption and temptation, because they can offer things that people want: the power of Khorne, the knowledge of Tanch, the pleasure of Slaanesh, the peace of Nurgle. They can corrupt almost anything. But they cannot corrupt something that has no use for what they offer, something that simply loves, cleanly and without qualification, in a way that all their bribes and seductions slide off. When the Emperor destroyed Horus, he shed that quality, in the immensity of the psychic force he directed, in the opening of every door and the burning of every reserve. He could not maintain the careful integration of all the different aspects of his being. Something was separated. A fragment of the Emperor's soul broke off and drifted into the warp. It is not lost. It is not destroyed. It is not corrupted. The very nature of it makes it incorruptible. It drifts in the immaterium, growing slowly, gathering the psychic resonance of humanity's highest aspirations the way a crystal gathers matter. Incrementally, over centuries, accreting around a seed. This fragment has a name, used by those few in the setting who know of its existence, the Star Child. The Chaos Powers know about it. This is important. They have known about it since the moment of its separation, and they are terrified of it. The Star Child is not merely a fragment of the Emperor's power. It is specifically the fragment that represents the aspect of the Emperor they cannot defeat through conventional means. It is the thing that, if it were ever to be reintegrated with the Emperor's psychic presence on the Golden Throne, would make him something qualitatively different from what he is now. More complete, more himself, and potentially in that completion capable of something that a mind fragmented and diminished is not capable of, genuine rebirth. This is not a small idea. In the eschatology of Warhammer 40k, the possibility being raised by the Star Child lore is that the Emperor's ultimate transformation is not simply recovery, not getting better and being able to get off the throne and continue where he left off. It is metamorphosis, something new, something that retains what the Emperor was but synthesizes it into a form that transcends the Golden Throne entirely. The older lore, from the realms of Chaos sourcebooks published in the earliest years of the game, describe this possibility in terms of the Emperor's eventual death serving as the birth of a new Chaos God, but a Chaos God of order, a fifth power in the warp that would be specifically opposed to the four ruinous powers. This framing has never been fully abandoned in the lore, though it has been complicated and nuanced in more recent publications. The more recent engagement with the Star Child concept can be found in the novel Throne of Light by Gav Thorpe, which takes the idea seriously in a 89th edition narrative context. The Star Child is not simply a background concept from old sourcebooks. It is an active element of the current setting's developing story. Forces within the Imperium are aware of it. Forces outside the Imperium are aware of it. The question of what it is, where it is going, and what happens when it completes its growth is one of the live mysteries of the current narrative. And the Chaos Gods are not passive about it. They have been doing things to try to prevent the Star Child's development. Subtle things, large things, things that span centuries. The targeting of specific psycho bloodlines, the corruption of certain warp currents to interrupt the accumulation of resonance around the growing fragment, the specific targeting, in some narratives, of individuals who might serve as vessels or catalysts for the Star Child's eventual reintegration with the Emperor. This is why the Star Child matters so much to understanding the broader question of whether the Emperor might speak again. Because if the current lore is building toward what the evidence suggests it might be building toward, then the Emperor's awakening is not a matter of the Golden Throne being fixed or his injuries healing. It is a matter of something coming back to him that was lost at the moment of his greatest act, a coming together that has been in progress for 10,000 years, and the psychic awakening, the proliferation of new and stronger human psyches across the galaxy, the appearance of individuals who carry traces of the Emperor's spiritual quality in places they have no business being. All of it potentially represents the early stages of that process becoming visible. The Star Child may be close to completion, and if it is, then everything that has ever been said about the Emperor's limitations, the inability to heal, the impossibility of awakening, the certainty that the Golden Throne has him permanently, may need to be completely reassessed. Part 9. The Terminus Decree and the Order that guards against hope. There is a document that does not officially exist. It has no entry in the records of the High Lords of Terror, no reference in any publicly accessible archive, no acknowledgement from any imperial institution that it was ever written, let alone that it carries the weight of absolute law. And yet there are people in the most powerful positions in the Imperium whose entire operational existence is shaped around it. People who have built their purpose, their training, their entire institutional philosophy around a single directive that, when you first encounter it, sounds almost too dark to be genuine. The Terminus Decree. Before we get to what the decree actually says, it is worth considering the moment it must have been issued, the post-heresy period, Those first terrible centuries after the battle on the vengeful spirit, after the Emperor was carried broken back to Terra, after the siege of Terra ended and the traitor forces fled back to the Eye of Terror, was not a period of stability, it was barely a period of survival. The Primarchs who remained loyal were reeling from the loss of their father, in any meaningful sense, from the betrayal of their brothers, from the destruction of the Great Crusade's dream. The institutions that would become the Imperium of the 41st millennium were only beginning to form. Everything was raw and provisional and uncertain. In that context, the Emperor, or those acting with his guidance, which at that point meant primarily Rogel Dawn and the few remaining loyal Primarchs, issued a decree that must have felt, at the time, like an act of profound and terrible wisdom, because it required everyone involved to accept a possibility they desperately did not want to accept. That the being on the throne might one day not be the Emperor in any meaningful sense. That 10,000 years of transformation might produce something that would need to be contained rather than celebrated. The people who had to agree to that decree, who had to nod and say yes, we understand, we will enforce this, were people who had just watched their father sacrificed on the altar of humanity's survival. People who were already devastated. Who were being asked to seal not just his physical body behind the throne's mechanisms, but the possibility of his return behind a wall of force and obligation that would prevent any unauthorized emergence. The emotional cost of agreeing to that decree is something the law mostly leaves unspoken. But it is present in the texture of how the post-heresy institutions behave, in the specific quality of the grief that saturates the founding history of the Imperium. The decree was issued. The Grey Knights were given their mandate. And for 10,000 years, the possibility the decree addresses has remained theoretical. Until now, the decree was issued by the Emperor himself, or by parties acting with his direct authorization. At some point around or shortly after the conclusion of the Horus Heresy and the Emperor's installation on the Golden Throne, its core directive is this: the Emperor must never leave the Golden Throne, under any circumstances, in any form. If he attempts to leave, if his consciousness manifests in the material world in a physical form, if his soul takes on independent material existence outside the throne's architecture, if any entity claims to be the Emperor returned to bodily life, that manifestation must be returned to the throne, not escorted, not supported, returned, by force if necessary. The institution given responsibility for enforcing this decree is the Grey Knights, the 666th chapter of the Space Marines, the most secretive fighting force in the Imperium. The specialists in fighting demonic forces, whose very existence is classified at levels that make inquisitorial black projects look like public knowledge. The Grey Knights were given the Terminus Decree as part of their foundational mandate. The degree to which this is an act of profound love or profound horror depends entirely on how you choose to read it. The case for Love the Emperor, in issuing or approving this decree, demonstrated an awareness of his own post-heresy state that no one else in the Imperium had. He understood that the being who would emerge from the Golden Throne, if and when the circumstances arose for emergence, might not be the Emperor that his servants remembered. He understood that 10,000 years of psychic battle and transformation might produce something that wore his face and carried his memories and spoke with his voice, but that was fundamentally altered in ways that could make it dangerous. The decree is a safeguard against the worst possible outcome: an Emperor-shaped entity of vast power that is no longer actually the Emperor, potentially a vehicle for chaos using his image to collapse the Imperium from within. He protected them from himself, even from the possibility of himself. The case for horror. The decree also means that even if the Emperor were to wake fully, even if the Star Child were to reintegrate and the metamorphosis were to complete, and the being that emerged were genuinely, truly him, recovered, whole, more powerful than ever, he would immediately be confronted by some of the most capable warriors in the Imperium, acting under his own ancient orders, attempting to put him back in the box. There is a reason this decree is one of the most discussed topics in 40k fan lore. It is a supreme irony. The one institution that might be capable of stopping the Emperor's return is acting on the Emperor's own authority. The Emperor has, in essence, instructed the Imperium to stop him from coming back, even if that coming back is exactly what the Imperium needs. Now, the counter-argument to the horror reading is that the Grey Knights are not automatons. They are men, enhanced, trained, psychically gifted and deeply disciplined men, but men who make judgments. The terminus decree presumably comes with guidance on how to evaluate whether an entity claiming to be the emperor is actually him or is a chaos deception. The decree is not, shoot anything claiming to be the emperor on sight. It is a doctrine for handling a specific category of extreme circumstance, and the people given responsibility for it are chosen specifically for their ability to operate in circumstances of extreme spiritual and moral complexity. But the pressure that places on whoever is in command of the Grey Knights at the moment when that circumstance arises is almost incomprehensible. Imagine being the person who has to make that call. Imagine standing before something that is manifesting the presence of the Emperor of mankind, looking at you with 10,000 years of awareness behind its eyes, speaking to you in a voice that carries a resonance your soul recognizes, even if your training tells you to be skeptical, and deciding whether to stand aside or to act. That is not a decision any human being is equipped to make with confidence, and yet someone will have to make it. There is also this: the terminus decree says must never leave in any form. Not must never leave if the circumstances are convenient or politically manageable. Must never. The absoluteness of it reflects the emperor's understanding of how such situations tend to play out when exceptions start being made. The Imperium is a civilization defined by the exception that became the rule, by the temporary measure that calcified into permanent practice, by the emergency protocol that became institutional habit. He knew that. He was there for the slow building of every structure and practice that eventually became the foundations of imperial culture. So he made the decree absolute. The problem is that absolute decrees about situations 10,000 years in the future, issued by a being who was then placed beyond the ability to update his own instructions, have a way of becoming inadequate to circumstances their authors could not fully anticipate. And the circumstances of the current era are very different from anything the post-heresy emperor could have anticipated. The Great Rift has split the galaxy. Guilliman has returned. Other forces are stirring. The Golden Throne is failing. The Star Child is growing. And across the Imperium, there are signs and portents that even the most conservative interpreters find difficult to categorize as mere coincidence. If the terminus decree is going to be invoked, it will be invoked soon. The question of who makes that decision, and whether they make it correctly, may be the most consequential single moment in the history of the Imperium. Part 10. The signs that keep coming. Reading the Emperor's movements, one of the things that makes Warhammer 40k genuinely interesting from a narrative perspective, as opposed to merely an extraordinarily detailed backdrop for wargaming, is that the setting rewards the kind of close reading that reveals patterns. Things that look like isolated incidents in one corner of the galaxy turn out to connect to things happening simultaneously in another corner. Themes recur. Images repeat. The setting has an author's underlying logic, even when it maintains the surface chaos of a grimdark war story. And when you start looking at the signs of the Emperor's possible stirring through that lens, reading them not as individual anomalies, but as parts of a pattern, what you find is genuinely striking. Let us go through them methodically. The girl in Ultramar during the Plague War. We discussed her already. The child called anathema by the servants of Nurgle. The focal point of calm in a storm of corruption. The ordinary human being whose presence drove demonic forces back. She was not the only such case during that campaign. There were multiple reports of similar individuals across Ultramar during Guilliman's push to reclaim the region. People with no obvious connection to each other, who functioned as psychic bright spots in the dark. The Inquisition investigated and found no common thread between them, no shared genetics, no common location, no unusual background, no contact with each other. Just people who were, somehow, more than they should have been, in ways that specifically countered the specific type of darkness they were surrounded by. The miracle at the Wall of Benediction, already discussed. The specific quality noted by the seers called in afterward the impression of the Emperor's presence in the warp around the event. Not a general uplift of psychic energy, a specific directional presence, a turning of attention. The Custodian and Cypher. This one is smaller in scale but deeply interesting in its implication. Cypher is one of the most mysterious figures in all of 40k lore, the fallen Dark Angel, former member of the First Legion, who has been hunted for 10,000 years by the Dark Angels and their successors, who carries a bolt pistol that he has never fired, who keeps trying to reach the throne room of the Emperor and keeps being stopped or escaping before reaching his goal. His stated purpose, insofar as he has one, is to reach the Emperor. to present something to him, to be judged. There is a recorded instance, canonical, documented in the Index Astartes and supplemental codex material, of Cypher actually reaching the antechamber of the Sanctum Imperialis, getting further than almost any unauthorized individual has ever gotten, standing outside the door and being told by the custodian at the door, not never. Not you are refused. Not you will be executed for trespassing in the most sacred space in the Imperium, but a temporal qualification, a specific choice of words that implies a future moment when the answer would be different. Not yet. A custodian, one of the Emperor's own personal guard, whose entire existence is devoted to the Emperor's will, and who would not use words carelessly in that context, said, not yet. To the man who has been trying to reach the throne for 10,000 years, that is not nothing. Think about what those two words imply. They imply a known schedule, a known sequence of events that has a specific future point in it where Cypher's arrival would be appropriate. They imply that someone with knowledge of that schedule, the Emperor himself, or the most senior custodians working from Imperial instruction, has communicated about it. The choice between no and not yet is the choice between closed and pending, between refusal and deferral, between an Emperor who is simply unavailable and an Emperor who is working towards something with a timeline. Not yet. The psychic awakening itself at scale. The billions of newly gifted or strengthened psychers across the Imperium represent something that has never happened before in documented history at this magnitude. The previous period that comes closest is the early stages of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's active presence in the galaxy created a kind of psychic stabilization effect that allowed talent to flourish more safely than it otherwise would. What is now being observed, scattered and partial and dangerous in many cases, has that same signature, not identical, not as controlled or as warm, but recognizable to those with the training to look. Something is influencing the human psychic field. Something is making the raw material of human potential more available, more present, more coherent. The most parsimonious explanation for that effect, given everything else we have discussed, is the Emperor, not acting in full force, clearly not, given the cost and chaos involved, but something. Some distributed expression of will or intention seeping through the connection that still exists between the Golden Throne and the broader psychic environment. A gentle pressure, a thumb on the scale, the visions. Astropaths across the Imperium, in numbers too large to dismiss, have been reporting a specific vision. Not an astropathic message, not something sent to them with intention and purpose by another mind. A spontaneous image. It appears during deep meditation, during the processing of other messages, during the quiet hours of off-duty contemplation. It is always the same image, a figure seated on a great throne, surrounded by light so intense it is visible even in the astropath's vision, sense, and the figure is not still. It is not the static, frozen figure of the Emperor, as he is typically depicted in the iconography of the imperial cult. It moves. Small movements. A head slightly turning, an eye beginning to open, a hand beginning to lift from its resting position. Nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive, but movement. The visions. Astropaths across the Imperium, in numbers too large to dismiss, have been reporting a specific vision. Not an astropathic message, not something sent to them with intention and purpose by another mind. A spontaneous image. It appears during deep meditation, during the processing of other messages, during the quiet hours of off-duty contemplation. It is always the same image, a figure seated on a great throne, surrounded by light so intense it is visible even in the astropath's vision sense, and the figure is not still. It is not the static, frozen figure of the Emperor, as he is typically depicted in the iconography of the imperial cult. It moves. Small movements, a head slightly turning, an eye beginning to open, a hand beginning to lift from its resting position. Nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive, but movement. The Emperor in the visions is not waking up in the sense of dramatic cinematic resurrection. He is doing something slower and more interesting. He is stretching. He is beginning to move in ways so incremental that they might not register individually, but that add up, across decades of visions reported by thousands of astropaths, to a directional trend. He is preparing. There is also this. Among the leagues of Votan, the ancient offshoot of humanity that dwell in the galactic core, those squat and resilient people with their ancestor cores and their own distinct relationship to the human psychic heritage. Certain of the oldest ancestor cores have begun broadcasting fragments of data they have never broadcast before. data that correlates, when examined by those with the knowledge to do the examination, to records made during the pre-heresy era. Records that should have been lost. Records that touch on subjects that even the ancestor cores normally regard as sealed and inaccessible. Whether this is coincidence, some cascade effect of the psychic awakening touching even the artificial psychic constructs of the leagues, or whether it represents something more specific is a question that the few scholars aware of the phenomenon have not been able to answer. But the pattern holds: things that were sealed are beginning to open. Things that were dormant are beginning to stir. The galaxy is waking up in small ways all at once, in every corner and in every tradition, and the common thread running through all of it is a directional quality, an orientation, subtle but consistent, towards something that feels like it is coming from the center, from Terra, from the throne. He is preparing. Part 11. What the Golden Throne's failure actually means. The clock is ticking. We cannot have this conversation without spending some serious time on the most immediate crisis in current 40k lore, because it is the context that gives all the other signs their urgency. The Emperor's possible awakening is not an abstract theological event occurring on a timescale of indeterminate future. It is an event that may be forced by circumstances within the lifetime of characters currently active in the setting. The Golden Throne is failing. Let us be specific about what this means, because the implications cascade in every direction. As established, the Golden Throne is not simply a life support machine, but it performs life support functions. The biological remnants of the Emperor's physical body are maintained by the throne's mechanisms, which regulate the environment around the organic material that still houses his consciousness. As the throne degrades, that maintenance becomes less reliable, as specific components fail and cannot be replaced with like materials, because the knowledge of how to manufacture those materials has been lost. Workarounds are implemented that are less efficient, that require more power input, that introduce failure modes the original design did not have. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not publicize the state of the throne. It cannot. The political and social consequences of the truth becoming widely known would be catastrophic. The kind of mass panic and heretical movements that would emerge from a public acknowledgement that the Golden Throne has approximately 100 years of functional life remaining would destabilize every institution in the Imperium simultaneously. The High Lords would fragment. The Ecclesiarchy would either rally into something dangerously fanatical or splinter into competing factions interpreting the news in incompatible ways. The Space Marine chapters would diverge in their responses. 100 different heresies, all claiming to have the answer to the coming crisis, would bloom across the galaxy. So the truth is maintained as an extreme secret, known only to a handful of the most senior and trusted figures in the Mechanicus and beyond. But secret crises do not stay secret indefinitely, especially when the evidence is visible to anyone with the technical knowledge to evaluate what they are seeing. The pilgrim who notices that the Astronomican's light seems slightly different from year to year. The custodian who catalogues in private records the subtle changes in the room's psychic resonance over decades. The senior astropath who notices that the warmth of the Emperor's presence, always previously constant, has developed what she describes as a kind of flicker, intermittent variations in intensity that were not there 50 years ago. These observations accumulate in private notes and private conversations among people who are too smart and too devoted to be comforted by official reassurances that everything is fine. The truth is felt even when it cannot be spoken. The novel vaults of terror. The Dark City brings this crisis into focus with a specific plotline involving the search for a solution. The solution being pursued involves the Drukhari, the Dark Elder, the dark kin of the Elder race, who dwell in their city of Comarai in the Webway, and who have, over 10,000 years of separation from their craftworld counterparts, developed a deep and terrible expertise in exactly the kind of arcane technology that the Golden Throne represents. Dark Age of technology artifacts, Webway interfaces, mechanisms that operate on principles the current Adeptus Mechanicus cannot duplicate. The Drukhari have maintained access to that technical tradition. The idea is extraordinary in its implications, that the Imperium, the most xenophobic major civilization in the setting, whose basic legal and doctrinal framework treats almost all contact with alien species as heresy, would seek the assistance of the most despised alien species in the galaxy to save the most sacred object in their civilization. The political and theological convolutions required to make that happen, to keep it secret, and to prevent it from destroying the individuals involved in the effort, constitute a thriller all on their own. But what it tells us about the state of the Golden Throne is stark. The Imperium has concluded that it cannot fix the problem with its own resources. Human knowledge, even at the highest levels of the Adeptus Mechanicus, is not sufficient. The solution requires knowledge from outside. This is significant beyond the immediate plot. It suggests that the Emperor's situation is one that has no purely mechanical resolution, that no amount of maintenance or repair or technical ingenuity can restore the Golden Throne to a stable, indefinitely sustainable state. The problem runs deeper than the mechanisms. The problem is that the throne was designed for a specific purpose with a specific user profile. And the 10,000 years of using it for a purpose, it was never intended for, have degraded it in ways that cannot be simply fixed from the outside. The only real solution, the solution that the tech priests who understand the throne's true nature know in the backs of their minds but cannot say aloud, is for the Emperor to stop being on the throne in the way he currently is on it. Either he dies, which would end the Astronomicon and collapse the Imperium's navigational network essentially overnight, followed fairly quickly by everything else collapsing, or he changes. Which brings us back to the Star Child, back to the metamorphosis hypothesis, back to the idea that the Emperor's path forward is not restoration but transformation. The throne is not fixable. The Golden Throne will fail. The Astronomicon, in its current form, will go out. The only question is whether, when it does, it is replaced by darkness or by something new. And the evidence we have been accumulating throughout this discussion, the signs, the miracles, the psychic awakening, the growing Star Child, the custodians not yet, Guilliman's report of intent and purpose in the throne room's psychic presence, all of it points toward the same answer. When the throne fails, something is meant to emerge from it. The Emperor has known this was coming. He has been preparing for exactly this for 10,000 years. The silence was not surrender. The silence was a chrysalis. Part 12. What happens if he wakes? The stakes of everything. This is the question that hangs over every element of current 40k's developing story. What actually happens if the Emperor fully awakens? What does the galaxy look like the morning after? Let us be honest about the fact that there is no certain answer here. The current lore is building towards something, and the shape of that something is visible in outline, but the specifics are genuinely not yet written, or not yet publicly revealed, and any claim to know exactly what comes next would be overconfidence. What we can do is lay out the realistic possibilities, weigh them against the evidence, and think seriously about which of them seems most consistent with where everything is pointing. The most simple version of events, the one that the imperial cult effectively prays for, and that the most optimistic reading of the lore supports, is a straightforward awakening. The Emperor rises from the throne. He is restored to something approaching his former power, or perhaps exceeding it, depending on how the metamorphosis hypothesis plays out. He takes direct command of the Imperium. He drives back the forces of chaos. He reunites the divided galaxy. He rebuilds what was broken. This is a genuinely compelling scenario, and it is not impossible, but it has problems. The custodes are the most interesting lens through which to examine those problems, because they are the people who know the most. Not just about the Emperor's current state, though they know more about that than almost anyone, but about the full scope of what his awakening would mean institutionally. They have had 10,000 years to think about it, in the way that people with vast time, a near-perfect memory, and no other responsibilities can think about a single question with extraordinary thoroughness. The custodians have changed in the current era. During the age of the Imperium, they were a largely cloistered institution, present on Terra, present in the immediate defense of the palace, but not a major active force in the galaxy's wars. The emergence of the Great Rift changed that. The Shield Captain Trajan Valoris, at a moment of extreme crisis, made a decision that 10,000 years of tradition had never sanctioned. He sent the custodians out into the galaxy. Active deployment. Combat operations beyond Terra. The 10,000 taking to the stars for the first time since the heresy. The official reason given was the protection of the Imperium at its moment of maximum vulnerability. Which is true, as far as it goes. But the unofficial reason, the one that circulates in the private deliberations of the most senior custodians, is related to what they believe is coming. If the Emperor is approaching some form of change or awakening, then the custodians need to be positioned to respond to what follows that change, not simply waiting on terror. They need to understand the current state of the galaxy that their charge is preparing to re-enter. They need to be the eyes and ears of the throne in a galaxy that has changed enormously since the last time the Emperor was fully present in it. The custodians going into the field is, in this reading, a preparation. The 10,000 are getting ready for the moment when they will be needed not just as guardians, but as an active force serving an active Emperor. Whether they are right about that moment coming is the question. But the fact that they have acted on that belief, have broken 10,000 years of tradition based on it, suggests that whatever they know or sense, or have been told about the Emperor's condition and trajectory, it is enough to change behavior at an institutional level. That is not nothing. The most immediate problem is the terminus decree. If the Emperor rises from the throne under any circumstances, some of the most effective warriors in the galaxy will attempt to stop him. Whether they succeed is another question, but the attempt alone would represent one of the most chaotic and destabilizing events in Imperial history. The Grey Knights confronting what appears to be the Emperor's return, evaluating it under the decree, making a judgment call. Whatever happens in that moment, it is not going to be orderly. The second problem is the Imperium itself. The civilization the Emperor would wake up into is not the civilization he tried to build. It is a theocracy that worships him as a god, a thing he specifically did not want during his lifetime, a thing he argued against explicitly, a thing his philosophy during the Great Crusade was explicitly designed to prevent. He would wake up to find that everything he tried to avoid has come to pass, that the very faith he discouraged has become the load-bearing wall of the civilization he created, and that the people he built his dream for have spent 10,000 years making the dream unrecognizable. Does he embrace it because the alternative is collapse? Does he dismantle it because it is antithetical to his original vision? Does he have the bandwidth to worry about either question when the galaxy is splitting apart at the seams? The metamorphosis version of events is stranger and potentially more hopeful. In this version, the Emperor who emerges from the throne after the Star Child reintegration is not simply the Emperor repaired. He is the Emperor transformed. He no longer requires the Golden Throne because he no longer exists in the same relationship to material reality that required the throne to sustain him. He is something more fundamentally psychic, a being whose existence operates primarily in the warp, who can manifest in the material world but is not anchored to it in the fragile way that flesh and blood demands. This is consistent with a kind of divinity that is genuinely functional rather than just symbolic. An Emperor who exists partly in the warp, who has completed the metamorphosis that the Chaos Gods went through, but in a direction they cannot oppose, would be an existential threat to the Chaos powers in a way that the physically bound Emperor never quite was. The four ruinous powers have always been able to keep the Emperor contained on the throne, limiting his impact to the beacon of the Astronomicon and whatever subtle guidance he can manage from that position. A post-metamorphosis Emperor, who is no longer contained by the throne's limitations, represents something they have been working for 10,000 years to prevent. The lore gives us hints that this is the version of events the Emperor himself is working toward. The way the psychic awakening is seeding human potential, the way the Star Child is growing toward completion, the way the custodian said, "not yet," rather than "no," implying that the moment of return has conditions, that those conditions are being worked toward, that there is a known sequence. If the metamorphosis is the truth of what is coming, then the Emperor's silence has been his deepest act of wisdom, because the metamorphosis cannot be hurried. The Star Child cannot be pushed to completion before it is ready without compromising what it will be when it arrives. The psychic awakening cannot be forced without producing psychers too unstable to serve the purpose they are being raised toward. Everything has had to grow at the rate it grows, over 10,000 years, and the Emperor has had to hold on and endure and maintain the Astronomicon and fight the warp from the inside and keep the lights burning for exactly as long as it takes. No more, no less. That is the version of events that most closely honors the character of the Emperor as the lore has built him. The being who made a plan 10,000 years in advance and executed it with the patience of someone who has lived 20,000 years and knows what patience looks like. The being who chose 20,000 years of walking in shadows over a premature bid for obvious power, because he could see further than anyone around him. If that is the Emperor, and the evidence suggests it is, then what is happening right now in the 41st millennium is not the beginning of the end. It is the ending of the beginning. 10,000 years of waiting for conditions that have only now been met. But there is a darker reading too, and it would be dishonest not to acknowledge it. Maybe the silence is not preparation. Maybe it is damage. Maybe the being on the throne is genuinely too diminished, too altered, too consumed by 10,000 years of fighting at the edge of death to be capable of anything more than holding on. Maybe Guilliman's discomfort after his throne room visit is not the discomfort of encountering something vast and alien and purposeful, but the discomfort of a man who went looking for his father and found something else wearing his face. Maybe the signs and miracles are not the Emperor reaching out, but the psychic residue of his long existence bleeding uncontrolled into the warp, creating phenomena that look like purpose from the outside but aren't. Maybe the Star Child, when it completes its growth, does not reintegrate with the Emperor, but simply becomes a new entity. The sixth god, the god of order, something that is the Emperor's spiritual child but not the Emperor himself. Something that will fight the chaos gods, but that will do so without any memory of being human, without any of the knowledge and care and 20,000-year wisdom that the Emperor carries. Maybe the throne fails and nothing emerges. Maybe the Astronomicon simply goes dark, and the Imperium collapses and humanity's long campaign in the galaxy ends not with transformation but with exhaustion. These possibilities exist, they are real. Anyone who tells you that 40k is definitely building toward a triumphant return is oversimplifying a setting that has always maintained its darkness as a matter of artistic and thematic commitment. But here is what I will say, with the confidence of someone who has read a lot of this lore carefully and thought about it seriously. The evidence pointing toward the hopeful reading is mounting. It is specific. It is consistent across multiple sources and narrative threads that were not written by the same people at the same time. It has the quality of deliberate seeding rather than accidental convergence. The Star Child is real lore, not fan speculation. The Psychic Awakening is real lore. Cypher's Not Yet is real lore. Guilliman's encounter is real lore. The Vaults of Terror crisis is real lore. The Noctis Eterna and the brighter return of the Astronomicon is real lore. None of these things, individually, proves that the Emperor is awakening. All of them together paint a picture of a setting that is building towards something enormous. Something that has been prepared for over a longer timeline than most storytellers would even attempt. Something that the creators of this universe have been laying groundwork for with extraordinary patience. The Emperor has not spoken in 10,000 years. He has not needed to. He has been working in a medium that most people around him cannot even perceive, on a timeline they cannot comprehend, toward a goal they can only glimpse the edges of. But the work is nearing completion. The chrysalis is almost ready to open, and when it does, the galaxy will hear a voice it has prayed to for 10,000 years and never received an answer from, finally break its silence, not with a whisper. Part 13. The final reflection. What his speaking would actually mean. There is a moment that the faithful of the imperial cult have dreamed about since the church first organized itself, since the first cardinal stood before the first congregation and spoke the first formal liturgy invoking the god, Emperor's name. A moment they have painted into cathedral windows and carved into the facades of temples, and whispered to their children at night when the lights go out and the darkness presses in. The moment when the Emperor answers, not through a saint, not through a miracle, not through a vision or a sign or the interpretation of events by a preacher who might be getting it completely wrong. A direct answer. Words. The voice of the person all of this has been built around, finally speaking, finally responding to the billions of prayers that have been washing over him for 100 centuries. What would that moment actually mean? It would mean different things to different people, and that difference would be, in itself, one of the most interesting things about it. For Guilliman, waiting at the center of a reformation, he has been carrying alone, making decisions in the dark with no guidance from the Father, whose will he is trying to implement. It would mean relief at an almost unbearable level. The Primarch who returned from stasis and found his civilization a shadow of what it had been. Who has been rebuilding with the tools available, and the knowledge he has, and the strategic vision that is genuinely extraordinary. But always with the knowledge that he might be getting it wrong. that he does not have the full picture, that the emperor's silence means there is always information he cannot access. Finally, having the silence break would change everything about how he operates. Not because the emperor would do the work for him, but because the uncertainty that costs him so much psychic energy would be resolved. For the custodians, standing their eternal vigil around a throne they have served without question for 10,000 years, it would be the answer to a question they have never allowed themselves to fully ask. These are men who gave up everything, name, family, history, any life beyond service, to guard something that does not speak to them, does not acknowledge them, does not respond to the care they pour into their duty with any visible reciprocity. They are faithful in a way that goes beyond what faith normally asks, faithful without reward, without acknowledgement, without the simple human comfort of being noticed by the thing you are devoted to. When the emperor speaks, if the emperor speaks, the first words he says will land on the custodians with a weight that no one else in the galaxy is quite equipped to understand. For the common people, the billions of farmers and workers and soldiers and pilgrims who have never heard of the Star Child or the Terminus Decree or the Psychic Awakening, who know the emperor only as the golden figure in the stained glass of their nearest shrine, who pray to him when they are scared and thank him when they survive. It would shatter and rebuild reality simultaneously. The God they were told was real turns out to be real. The faith they have maintained through generations of war and loss and sacrifice is vindicated. There is a version of this that produces rapture. There is also a version that produces the most intense theological crisis in human history, as people wrestle with the gap between the emperor they prayed to and the emperor that actually speaks, which will never perfectly match the deity they have constructed in 200 centuries of devotion. For the forces of chaos, the dark gods, their daemon servants, the corrupted humans who have given themselves over to the ruinous powers, it would be something closer to what a species feels when the predator it never quite outran finally catches up. The Chaos Gods have had 10,000 years in which the Emperor's threat was real but limited. He is powerful on the throne. He can act, but he cannot act freely. He cannot project his will across the galaxy with the force and the directness that a fully awakened, post-metamorphosis being would be capable of. The current arrangement, where they press against his civilization and erode it from the edges and find purchase in every weakness and shadow, depends critically on him remaining bound. If that changes, everything changes. The war that has been running for 10,000 years suddenly has a new combatant in it. Not a Primarch, not a saint, not a Daemon's Lair chapter. The Emperor himself, free for the first time in 10 millennia, operating with whatever power and wisdom those 10 millennia have built. That is not a comfortable thing for the Chaos Gods to contemplate. For the Eldar, those ancient beings who have watched humanity fumble its way through the galaxy for thousands of years, who remember the Emperor when he was a young man by their standards, who have their own complicated relationship to the question of gods and faith and the entities of the warp. His awakening would mean a potential ally of genuine capability in the war against Chaos. The Craftworld Elder and their kin have their own struggles with the Chaos powers. Their own god Cain was shattered. Their new god Unid is still forming. They are diminished and scattered and fighting extinction by inches. An emperor who rises would not be their salvation. Nothing is quite that simple in 40k. But he would represent a shift in the cosmic balance that is not unfavorable to their survival. And for the setting itself, for the stories that can be told within it, for the narrative possibilities that his awakening would open, the implications are profound. Warhammer 40,000 has been a story of humanity enduring, of holding on, of the nobility and horror of survival at all costs. The Emperor's awakening would not end that story, but it would change its genre. It would shift something fundamental in the texture of what the setting is. From pure grimdark, where darkness is absolute and permanent, towards something harder to name. Something that still contains darkness, because the 40k setting is too committed to its themes to ever fully leave the dark, but that also contains something brighter. Not optimism exactly. Not the naive certainty that everything will be fine, but the earned, hard-won 10,000 years in the making knowledge that the darkness was not the last word, that the silence was not surrender, that the chrysalis was not a grave, that the thing that breaks through, when it finally does, will be worth the wait. Epilogue: the silence holds. For now the door to the Sanctum Imperialis is closed. The custodians stand at their posts, the candles burn, the prayers continue. The Astronomicon shines in the warp, its beacon guiding ships across impossible distances through the medium of a dead man's dream. Except he is not dead, not precisely, not yet, which is the whole point. Somewhere in the failing architecture of the Golden Throne. Something that was once a man and is now far more. Something that walked the ancient world when the great civilizations of humanity were young, that fought in every war worth fighting, that built and lost and built again, and kept going past every reasonable stopping point, is still working. The consciousness is vast and strange and changed beyond what any of the people who love him could fully recognize. But it is there, and it is not still. It is moving. Somewhere on a world near the galactic core, a child who has never been tested for psychic potential sits up in the middle of the night with a feeling she cannot name. Something warm, like a light on in a distant window. Something that feels like being seen by something far away, somewhere in the corridors of the Inquisition's deepest archives. A scholar who has spent 40 years cataloguing the reports of minor miracles finds himself staring at a pattern in his data that he has been building toward for decades without recognizing it. A shape in the distribution, a direction to the occurrences that cannot be explained by local warp conditions or statistical noise. Something that is pointing at terror. Somewhere in the warp itself, in a dimension where time and space and substance follow different rules than the ones that apply in the material world. Something small and brilliant and ancient and new continues to grow, gathering, becoming, moving toward a completion that it was separated from 10,000 years ago in the most violent and consequential moment in human history. The silence will break. It may break gently, with the subtlety of a new astropathic vision or a soldier unexpectedly surviving an unsurvivable wound. It may break catastrophically, with the force of a psychic detonation felt across the entire galaxy simultaneously. It may break in ways that no one in the current setting has correctly anticipated, because the being doing the breaking has a perspective on the galaxy that none of them share. But it will break, and when it does, the 10,000 years of prayers that have gone unanswered will finally get their response. Not the response anyone was expecting, something better, something harder, something that asks more of humanity than it has ever been asked, and trusts, with the deep, earned, 20,000-year certainty of a being who has always bet on humanity in the end, that humanity is capable of rising to meet it. The Emperor has not spoken in 10,000 years. But he is not finished. If you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending this much time here with me. This kind of deep lore exploration is exactly what this channel exists for. Taking the threads that are buried in sourcebooks and novels and codex entries and pulling them out into the light where we can look at them properly. The question of the Emperor's possible return is one of the biggest things hanging over the current era of 40k. And it deserves the kind of treatment where we actually sit with the evidence rather than just stating a conclusion. I want to hear what you think about all of this. Where do you stand on it? Do you think the setting is genuinely building towards something? Or do you think the signs and portents are intentionally kept ambiguous to give Games Workshop flexibility? Is the metamorphosis reading compelling to you? Or does the grimdark logic of the setting make you think the darker interpretation is more honest? Leave it in the comments. I read all of them, and the best discussions on this channel happen there. If this is the kind of content you want to see more of, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps other people find the channel. And subscribe if you aren't already so you don't miss whatever we go deep on next. There is so much more to explore. The setting is enormous, and the questions worth asking about it never run out. I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.